Gonna get started. Everybody settle down, please. Okay, so you will have your exam scores by the latest Monday. If they come back sooner than that, I'll post them sooner than that. Keep in mind that there's about 170 of you. You know, there's essay, fill in the blank, and all that's being hand graded. So it takes some time. It certainly won't be past Monday. So that means that starting Tuesday's office hours, you can come in and view your exam, okay? From now to the end of the semester, you can view all 3 exams once we get to the 3rd one, okay? Leading up to the final. Now, that being said, those of you who have come to office hours, you see that I actually have been bringing the box with me. I will not be bringing a box of exams 1 and 2, though, okay? So starting on Tuesday, I'll have the full box of exam 2s, but if you wanted to see exam 1, then I need you to let me know, because I won't have those on me, okay? But I will go ahead and start carrying all of exam 2, and then when it gets time for the final, and you guys want to see all 3 exams, again, that'll be a situation where you'll have to let me know, because I'm not carting around all 3 exams at once. We are halfway through, right? So we have half of the semester left, half of the material left. And some of you on Tuesday or Monday might find out that you got an A on exam 1, an A on exam 2, and exam 3 is going to be your drop one, right? And so you're going to decide to maybe not focus as much on it, which is perfectly fine. But I do recommend that you not skip an exam ever, okay? If you decide not to come here and that exam gets scored as a 0, that is your dropped exam. So it's okay to get a 0 on an exam and have that be your score. But, again, I don't recommend that, okay, for a couple of reasons. One, you need the practice with the questions, the material, getting tested on it, that kind of stuff. And the exam is the way for you to do that outside of homework and clickers. The other thing is that this next section, or this next exam 3, is 4 chapters worth of material, okay? It's a big bulk of material, and it's 2 different physiological systems. We're going to do all of respiratory system and then all of the renal system. And all of that comes on this one exam. So content level wise, this exam is really heavy. So you want to make sure that you're staying on top of this content as best as possible. Concept level wise, you'll find that a lot of the respiratory stuff is going to piggyback on some concepts you learned in cardiovascular. So it's not too terrible in that sense. Of the 2, the renal stuff will probably be the one that gives us a little bit of trouble just in terms of, again, content level, the difficulty, that kind of stuff. But if you stay on top of it, again, you should be fine. There is another homework, and I'll make sure to get that homework. It's on D2L, but I have to change some dates. And so I'm going to change those dates, and then you guys will have access to it. But, again, the due date is just like all the others have been, so it's like the Sunday before you take your next exam, okay, which is still a ways away. After the 3rd exam, I will be posting, it's probably already on D2L, but I really won't draw your attention to it until after the 3rd exam, which is a calculation spreadsheet, okay? That calculation spreadsheet allows you to put numbers in for exam 1, 2, 3, kind of relative idea on homeworks and all that kind of stuff. So you can figure out, you know, if I want a B+ in this class, I need to earn a 75% on the final in order to do that. So that calculation spreadsheet will let you do that. I will post your clicker scores during spring break, where you are so far anyway. We still have a whole month to go, but I will still post those for you, keeping in mind that you get to drop your 3 lowest clickers, which really are days that you don't show up to class, because that's ultimately what a 0 clicker score is. Okay? Any questions? Yes, Grant. Begin submissions? I mean, I could do it as early as next week. Most people don't even bother their first submission until we've gone through a bulk of the material, which is going to be well after spring break. So there's a lot of time for that. But I mean, I can open it up. The problem is that, remember, if you open that first attempt and don't do anything with it, that is your first attempt. Any other questions? Okay, so let's go ahead and get started then. So the first section we're going to do is the respiratory section. And the respiratory section in your textbook is actually divided into 2 separate chapters. It starts with chapter 17, which is a lot of the mechanics and the process of bringing air from the atmosphere into your lungs. Chapter 18, which immediately follows, is all about gas exchange. Hemoglobin, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and how those things diffuse from alveoli to blood to tissue, and then kind of back out to the environment, okay? So we essentially have a mechanics of ventilation followed by gas exchange and kind of the chemistry behind controlling ventilation and how we adjust our breathing rate and breathing depth. Before we get started again, you guys know I like to kind of do an overview of systems and why these systems are relevant or important to us, as well as just kind of some general definitions of what's going on. So when we hear the term respiration, that term can actually have more than one meaning because it depends on what type of respiration you're looking at. So one type of respiration is internal respiration. And internal respiration is a series of chemical reactions and processes that ultimately utilize oxygen to produce ATP. Okay? Internal respiration is essentially analogous with cellular respiration, and all of those concepts we learned in Phys 1. So essentially, the steps that are aerobic, that take that oxygen and utilize it as that final electron acceptor to then give you your large ATP yield is considered respiration because you are utilizing that gas to do so. So your internal or cellular respiration, again, is all depicted by what's up here. And again, does fall into this category of gases because we're using that oxygen, and as we know, throughout the Krebs cycle, producing carbon dioxide. This type of respiration, or this specific definition of respiration, is not what we're going to spend our time talking about in the next couple of chapters. Okay, what we're going to spend our time talking about instead is defined as external respiration. And external respiration instead describes all of the steps involved with getting air from the atmosphere, bringing it into the alveoli, allowing for gas exchange, and then getting that air, those gases down to your peripheral tissues. And then from there, essentially letting your tissues take over and perform that cellular respiration. External respiration is going to involve 4 major steps, or there are going to be 4 major things that happen with external respiration. The first is going to be bringing air from the atmosphere into the lungs, or essentially an exchange of air between atmosphere and lung. And if we look at the figure over here, the atmosphere is kind of all this tannish area that's surrounding the picture. And then the big white round bubble is essentially the lung space. So it's kind of the collective space of all of the alveoli. That process of moving large volumes of air between the atmosphere and your lungs is called ventilation. So ventilation is your big first step required in the entire process of external respiration. From there, there's going to be gas exchange. So the first site of gas exchange will be between the alveoli and the blood, where oxygen is going to diffuse from the alveoli into the capillaries, and carbon dioxide is going to diffuse from the capillaries into the alveoli. Once the blood finishes passing through the lungs and expels as much CO2 as it needs to and gains as much oxygen as it needs to, then we depend on transport. Okay? So the next step is to transport those gases through the blood, which allows the gases to get to their final location where we once again have exchange. So there's a kind of a final step of exchange. And in this case, what we will have is oxygen diffusing from the capillaries into your peripheral tissues, and carbon dioxide that has been produced by cellular respiration diffusing from your peripheral tissues and into the capillaries. The diffusion of the gases is something that will be highly dependent on gradients. And the gradients that the gases depend on for diffusion are measured as pressures, which we will discuss when we do gas exchange. For now, what we want to discuss is more so the mechanics of ventilation. how do we get the large volumes of air from the atmosphere into the lungs? In which case, we're not looking at specific gases, but instead we're just looking at a liter of air. How do I get that from here in, okay, and vice versa? That boils down the functions of the respiratory system into really just a select few. So there are some primary functions, and then there are kind of some secondary things that the respiratory system does for us, but is not the sole reason why that respiratory system exists. The primary function is the sole reason why it exists, which is to allow for this gas exchange that is necessary for aerobic respiration. So when we take a look at this primary function, we're essentially looking at all of the steps associated with that external respiration. And so we can see that oxygen is coming into the lungs, where the blood will pick up that oxygen, deliver it to the tissues, expel CO2, which then the CO2 gets delivered back to the lungs and expelled out into the environment, right? What we will learn in the next week and a half, 2 weeks or so, is that you're never going to have a situation where your blood has 0 CO2, 0 O2. There's always some of both. And even though blood is defined as being oxygenated versus deoxygenated, that doesn't mean 0 O2. That just means low O2 versus really high O2. Okay? And the same goes with carbon dioxide. We're going to have lower levels, higher levels, but all within a homeostatic limit and within a homeostatic range. Some secondary functions of the respiratory system include pH balance. And again, this is something we're going to learn in the next couple of weeks. But one of our gases, carbon dioxide, is going to actually have some determination of pH. Carbon dioxide can shift your blood's pH levels when it is too high or too low. So the respiratory system can help to very quickly adjust blood pH by adjusting CO2 levels. And that's easy for the respiratory system to do because all you do is adjust how much CO2 you breathe out to the environment. And so there is a small but pretty significant control of blood pH. The respiratory system does provide some protection in the form of immune protection. And that, again, is extremely important because the respiratory system is continuous with the external environment. And as being continuous with the external environment, it brings in foreign particles with every single breath you take. And those foreign particles might not all be pathogenic or dangerous, but they're all considered foreign to a certain extent, right? A lot of it is dust, which gets cleared out pretty early on. But for things that don't get cleared out early on, you need some immune effects there. So the mucosa of the respiratory tract has quite a bit of immune cells to it. It's one of the important places where you have a lot of immune cells. It does provide a route for water and heat loss. Regardless of the environment that you live in, the air that you breathe out of your body is very humid. Okay? Even if you live in an extremely humid environment, you're still going to breathe out humid air because you humidify air as it moves through the respiratory tract and causes some water loss. It is kind of defined as unregulated water loss, nonsensical water loss, and the reason it's described that way is because you can't regulate it. So there's no way to regulate water loss through the lungs. It's one of those things that just kind of happens. And so there's other systems of the body that will help regulate water balance, but a mechanism of water loss is the lungs. Same with heat, okay? Now, heat does become an important factor given environments. If you live in an environment that is very cold, then you need to warm your air up before it gets down to your alveoli. It could cause core body temperature changes, and we don't want that to create a disturbance to the system. When the air starts coming out now, it is warmed up. And so it is another mechanism of heat loss for us that we adjust with other mechanisms, but still something that can happen. The last kind of secondary effect here is the ability to produce sound, okay? Vocalization is just sound production. Vocalization should not be confused with speech production, because they are technically different things. Vocalization is just sound. So you can make a sound by air moving from the lungs up through all of those respiratory tubules across the vocal cords and causing them to vibrate, right? But if you're going to form speech, forming words, forming sentences, things like that, then it depends on a whole lot more than just air moving through those vocal cords. It depends on muscle contractions, higher brain thought process, movement of the mouth in a certain way. So just the sound production is the respiratory tract, okay? Along with the vocal cords. So of course there are things that if the vocal cords are damaged or inflamed, it affects sound because of how they themselves vibrate. The lungs are surrounded by a couple of layers of tissue that very significantly affect their function. So this is something that you've learned all the way back in anatomy. And at the time, I know you learned your serous layer, your visceral layer, parietal layers, all this stuff. And you probably thought to yourself, this is the last time I ever have to think about this again. And I'm here to tell you you're wrong. In a nice way, because you're going to find this concept pretty cool in terms of how this works, okay? So recall that the lungs are in what's called a pleural cavity, right? Really just, it's that space in the thoracic cavity, and the pleural cavity really is the tiny, tiny area between the two serous membranes. So you kind of see this little gap right in here. So you have your lungs in pink, and then the dark red line is your visceral pleura. The other dark red line on the outside is the parietal, and then the space in between is that pleural cavity, right? And you guys should recall from anatomy that that pleural cavity has fluid in it, serous fluid. It's kind of like a egg whitey, soapy type of fluid, right? Really slippery. And one of the main things it does is helps to provide an adjustment to friction. So if you think about it, your lungs are always rubbing up against the walls of the rib cage every time they inflate and every time they deflate. And that friction could potentially cause damage to the tissue. Heat can build up. It can actually burn tissue. So that serous fluid helps with that, right? The other thing that the serous fluid does is it helps to create somewhat of a suction, okay? So remember that one of these layers, your visceral layer, is attached to the lung. And then your parietal layer is actually fixed to the rib cage, okay? Then you have that pleural cavity in the middle, which is kind of just this double-blind sac that doesn't have an opening anywhere. It is a closed-off area that has fluid in it, okay? So these two layers, your visceral layer and your parietal layer, they are suctioned to each other, okay? And the best analogy I can give you is one that, actually, I think I stole from your textbook, but it's a really good analogy. So if you think of, you got dishes, okay? And in those dishes, it's soapy water, okay? And you have two panes of glass, just plain glass, flat panes of glass. And if you wet them and put them together, okay, chances are you can easily slide them past each other, right? Because they're going to glide across that soapy water. But if you were to try to grab the edges and pull them apart, it's probably going to be near impossible to do so. Okay, that is how the serous fluid, visceral and parietal membranes work. Now, think about the lungs for a minute. They're not hard, rigid panes of glass. They're really soft, very expandable tissue, right? So if the parietal layer is fixed to your rib cage, visceral layer is fixed to the lung. If the rib cage moves, what is it going to do to the lung because of the suction? It's going to pull the lung with it, right? And when it pulls the lung with it, it changes a lot of things on the inside of the lung. It changes pressures, it changes volume, and all of that helps to drive airflow from the atmosphere to the lung. This is why a puncture to the rib cage that perforates into that pleural cavity causes lungs to collapse. They're no longer suctioned to the rib cage and can't move with the rib cage because of that loss of suction. So having this setup is extremely important to ensure that the lungs can change volume because they themselves aren't muscle. They can't contract, they can't move alone. They have to be aided somehow, and the aid comes from this anatomical setup between those visceral and parietal layers. Okay, So again, a little bit more anatomy, but there's important purpose to this. Gas exchange, so that movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide, is something that occurs throughout the entire respiratory tract. Is that a true or false statement? Did you get my email? Good. So I called Steve actually and I asked him and he said not for a couple weeks, but I think the application's available. So like if you go to that website that I included in the email, you just click on it and if you go there, there should be an application for each position. So the UGTA specialist, the UGTA, and then the intern, okay? For the UGTA specialist and the UGTA, there is a grade requirement. Right. It has to be, I think it's B or better. Could be B plus, I don't know. Not that you can't do that, but I'm just letting you know. And then the internship, there isn't one. Okay. So, you can still do that in the internship, though. Like, you're still going to be working with things. You have to dissect out muscles. And if you don't know what they are, you can't dissect them out. So, you'll still do that a little bit. So once you do that, I want to say you're going to submit it to Steve. And then Steve will let us know and that kind of stuff. But if you're really committed to it and you want to do it, you'll be good to go with me. Oh, yeah, it's bad. Well, how are you doing right now? Okay. That's all it is. Yeah, all it is memorization. And then you come to physiology and it's like, not so much. Yeah. All right, couple more seconds. Okay. So somebody please tell me what you picked and why.
I said false because it would only be so specifically at the lungs, not the entire.
So essentially, when you think about diffusion of gases, you want it to be at a place that is optimal for it, at a place that makes sense. And so remember that diffusion is dependent on distance. And if there is a huge distance, so many, many layers or very thick membrane, then diffusion isn't optimal and it's not practical, right? So the entire respiratory tract does not serve well for diffusion of gases. The only place that serves well for diffusion of gases is the alveoli and a small area called the respiratory bronchioles. And that's pretty much it. So this would be false, okay? You only have true diffusion of gases in those other areas. And granted, the surface area in those areas is huge, but still limited to just that part of the lung. So that's not to say that all these other areas are useless in terms of function, right? All these other areas do serve important purposes. And so hopefully some of these things are review for you as far as some terminology, but we have the respiratory tract divided into two separate zones, the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. The conducting zone is a very important region. It serves an important function, which is to prepare the air that you bring in from the atmosphere before it gets to the alveoli. Okay? Some of that preparation includes changing the temperature. Again, depending on where you live. But you guys, I mean, you're juniors, seniors, you've been in Colorado at least 4 years, unless you're a transfer student. And in those cases, you know that it could be -5 outside on certain days, right? And that air of -5 degrees is certainly not -5 degrees when it gets to your alveoli. So there is a very rich supply of blood vessels in the submucosal layers of the entire respiratory tract, at least up to the bronchioles, that will conduct heat onto the air you're breathing in. And what that really does is help to ensure that we don't have significant or drastic changes in core body temperature. Because of the huge surface area of the alveoli, if they encountered a negative 5-degree air, that could cool your body down really, really quickly. So we prevent that from happening through that conducting zone. The other thing, and again, Colorado is just an excellent example, is humidity, right? Colorado is not humid, period. You know, it's pretty dry around here. It has its days, but it's pretty dry. That air, as dry as it is, could dry out the epithelial layers. So again, we prevent that from happening by humidifying the air. And mostly, again, what happens is through a conduction process, water vapor from the epithelial lining will get added to that air. And so the air that you have in your lungs and the air you breathe out is very humid. Okay? You can also kind of sweep the air, so to speak, and filter out foreign material. Colorado is not the best example for this because, relatively speaking, Colorado's pretty clean air. It's nice, clean air, right? But an area that perhaps is more polluted, a little bit more dusty, a little bit more smoggy, okay? This is an important aspect to your respiratory tract in those cases. And so you have areas where you can trap particles. Those particles then kind of get swept out of the system, back into your mouth, is where they go. And then it doesn't make it to your alveoli. So it kind of prevents any kind of potential disease process from occurring because of these foreign particles. From a disease standpoint, really we're trying to prevent bacteria, viruses, other things that you might breathe in from getting way too far down into the alveoli. And then also dust, debris, particles. While those might not necessarily cause disease, they can lead to loss of lung function over a very long period of time. And so you can cause your lungs to just not become as stretchy, not to become as elastic if they breathe in too much of these kind of, let's say, dusty, chemical-like components. The ability to trap particles like dust and debris and bacteria and viruses is heavily dependent on, again, the anatomy and the makeup of the respiratory tract. And primarily, again, this is all of the conducting zone, where you will find pseudostratified epithelium. And pseudostratified epithelium is ciliated, okay, to where these cilia function very well as kind of like sweeps, okay? When cilia move, they whip back and forth, and that can create a movement that kind of makes this mucus layer at the top scoot along, okay? And it looks like a little conveyor belt to a certain extent. This pseudostratified epithelium is constantly producing saline, and then mucus is constantly being produced by goblet cells. So if you kind of take a look at what you have here, these epithelial cells, which are the pseudostratified cells with the cilia, they're always making saline, and then these goblet cells are always producing mucus. The mucus will travel all the way up and be found on the superficial most component here. And then just deep to that, bathing and surrounding all the cilia is the saline. Mucus is thick, it's sticky, and if it were to surround the cilia couldn't move because of its thickness, okay? So the saline that bathes the cilia helps to maintain a fluidity. It helps to give a solution that is very liquidy and watery for those cilia to beat back and forth. And then with the mucus above it, the stickiness of the mucus allows us to trap the debris, the particle, all of these things that need to be eliminated from the respiratory tract. Once these particles get trapped, the cilia beat in a fashion that moves that mucus layer up towards your mouth. It's essentially called the mucociliary escalator. So if you think of an escalator as going up, right? So it's going from like your bronchioles and from your primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi back upward, right? Most of the time you don't notice because it's going to make it to your mouth. And then what do? You swallow. It goes into your stomach. Your stomach's very acidic. And so if you did trap some bacteria, some viruses, chances are the acidity of your stomach is going to kill those things. Okay? Some people have an unbelievable ability to create these thick, nasty mucus balls and spit them out. Congratulations. Some of us can't do that. I cannot do that. I've tried, and it's just an abysmal attempt. And so people will spit it out. Now, how many of you, this happened to me as a child growing up, were sick, and your parents would tell you, if you don't spit that out, you're going to stay sick, because it's just going to stay in your lungs. My parents told me this all the time. You have to spit it out, you're going to stay sick. And that's a flat-out lie. Because if you don't spit it out, now swallowing it is not fun, but if you don't spit it out and you swallow whatever you cough up because you're sick, it's going to your stomach, where your stomach, again, is acidic. It's going to pretty much kill everything. There's some things that actually like the acidity, but for the most part, anything you breathe in really isn't going to like that environment. So you kill it through another primary means of defense, which is the acid in the stomach. Okay. Again, most people are like, well, no, I don't swallow it because that's gross. I agree with you. But if you just don't have that ability, then all you've left with is really to swallow it. Like I said, it's not the best. So saline, how is it produced? And we've talked about this to a certain extent. So hopefully a little bit of this looks familiar. But we talked about saline production in the digestive tract and how saline is necessary to provide a liquidy environment in the pancreas for us to then secrete large amounts of pancreatic juice. So the mechanism in the lung is the exact same. We have these epithelial cells that allow us to produce a saline solution. And let's kind of follow what exactly happens to create this saline solution. So on the basolateral surface, you have a specific transporter that functions off of secondary active transport. This transporter helps us to move sodium, potassium, and chloride into the cell. Because it helps to move those 3 different ions, this particular transporter oftentimes gets abbreviated as the NKCC. Now notice that electrochemical balance is maintained because we have 2 positives coming in, 2 negatives coming in, and there's no membrane potential change. Okay? You'll notice that potassium can leak right back out, so there's a balance of potassium concentrations. We have our sodium-potassium pump, which also helps us maintain gradients. So the main purpose of this NKCC is to get chloride from this interstitial space into the epithelial cell. Once chloride enters into the epithelial cell, it can then diffuse down its electrochemical gradient out of the cell and into the lumen. So you might ask yourself, why doesn't that saline go back the other way? Why doesn't, not the saline, the chloride, why doesn't the chloride just come right back from where it came, right? The reason is there are no transporters on the basolateral side for the chloride. The transporters for the chloride are only on that apical surface. So as we let that chloride in, it really only has one place to go. This specific channel is referred to as the CFTR. It is an anion channel that can be regulated through other ligands. And so it can be closed, it can be opened. It just depends on what the needs of the cell are. Now, as chloride enters into the lumen, it is going to create an electrical gradient. So the negative charge of chloride is going to pull sodium, and that happens through the transcellular pathway. So as sodium and chloride start to build up, it is then going to pull water through osmotic pressure, and you end up with a watery, salty solution, which is essentially saline. Okay? So through these very specific cellular mechanisms, you've been able to make this watery solution that can now bathe those cilia and keep the mucus above the cilia so you can create that mucociliary escalator. So think about that mechanism, and I can bounce back to it here in just a moment if you want me to. But I want you to think about it and then answer this question for me. So, predict which of the following would occur if that CFTR channel that we just talked about were absent. So do you believe that there wouldn't be an osmotic gradient pulling water into the lumen of the respiratory tract? That there would be a greater electrical gradient in the lumen of the respiratory tract? That the mucus lining of the respiratory tract would become too thick? Or is it a combination of these things?
What would be stopping the chlorine from following the sodium and the...
Sodium follows chlorine, the chloride.
I mean, what would it be? What would the chlorine? What would be stopping the chlorine from following the sodium and the water up through the tract in the middle?
Oh, the paracellular pathway. Chloride forms a bigger water shell than sodium does. And because of that, it's too big to get through that paracellular pathway.
I was going to say, because I know it's one of the most electronegative.
Mm-hmm.
So I would assume it would just be trying to follow.
Right. It's the water shell that prevents it from doing that. Because the water shell is so significant. Because it's so electronegative, it really attracts all those hydrogens of the water to create a big water shell. And so because that water shell is so large, it just doesn't allow it. Sodium's water shell is a lot smaller.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I know I'm 90% sure that A is part of it.
Okay.
What I'm unsure of is the mucus lining of the respiratory tract would become too thick. Isn't it more to do with just a saline layer? So it wouldn't...
So if you think of egg whites, which are kind of watery, thinned out, but still sticky like a mucusy thing, versus, what would be a good example? Do you remember, what's that stuff called? The rubber cement?
Yes.
That glue? Okay.
Yes.
One of them has more water in it than the other because the water helps thin things out. And so the saline not only helps bathe those cilia and give us that kind of liquidy environment, but it controls the thickness of that mucus. So the mucus can still trap things. It can still grab onto particles, but it remains somewhat thin so that it doesn't create clumping.
Okay. So it does affect
Mm-hmm.
this layer.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah.
So my brother had half of his lung removed. He had like a growth in his lung last February. How do they go in and remove like a section of your lung without deflating? Like if you're puncturing that?
So, to a certain extent, they do. And it's okay because they have other mechanisms that they use in the lab to help with it because he's on a respirator and respirators force air into the lungs. The only reason you really need that pleural space is for you to get air in yourself. But if you're going to use a compressor, okay, to push air in, you don't need that pleural suction. And so they'll do that temporarily. Then, oh yeah, because people get punctured ribs all the time. You break a rib in an accident, it punctures through, and you're going to collapse a lung. What they have to do is basically take like a big barrel syringe and suck out the air and then put a seal over the hole, and it'll repair itself. Yeah. Couple more seconds. Okay. So again, somebody please tell me what you chose and why. What do you think would happen in a situation like this? Mm-hmm.
I chose D because the CFTR wasn't there, and there would be no CL that enters into the lumen, so then there would be a gradient of the water in there, and there's no water in there.
Good. So it is both A and C. If you don't have that chloride, then you cannot move chloride through. If you don't have that channel, you can't move chloride through. If you can't move the chloride through, then you're going to get neither the sodium or the water, so no saline. No saline means that these cilia are no longer going to have a smooth environment to move in. mucus is going to get thickened, clumpy. It's a bad situation. So you end up getting both A and C. So anybody want to take a gander at what CF stands for? I heard it a couple times. Cystic fibrosis. So this channel was named after discovering its importance in the pathophysiology of cystic fibrosis. So it is referred to as the cystic fibrosis transport regulator. So how does this work? Again, from the standpoint of a pathophysiology. Cystic fibrosis oftentimes gets correlated with being just a lung disease, and that is not true. That is the most apparent place that it is seen, and most of the symptoms really arise early on at the lungs. But there are other things that happen because of all of the places where this particular channel is found. So it's found in sweat glands. When you sweat, your sweat is salty, but it's not horribly salty. And the reason why is because the sweat glands, as water moves up the sweat glands, they pull solutes back into your body. Not all of them, but most of them, okay? And then digestive organs, particularly the pancreas, has a lot of these CFTR channels. So what this is actually a double recessive allele where you do not have the protein or you don't have the genes that code for this specific channel. It's regulated by a couple of different things. Primarily, it's nucleotide dependent, and it's regulated by ATP. So when ATP binds, the channel's open. When ATP is unbound, the channel is closed, okay? If you don't have this particular channel, then you cannot make that saline, right? Again, most apparent symptoms become lung early on because it's very difficult to breathe when there's all this clumped up mucus in the lungs. It's very difficult to move air, and there's a huge risk factor for a lot of respiratory diseases, respiratory illnesses, because all of these bacteria that normally get easily swept up and away, they don't. They just kind of get trapped in there, and then bacteria love mucus because it's sugary and protein filled, and it's a great place to grow. And so they really kind of proliferate in that environment. Now, what ends up making this pathology more dangerous is the digestive effects that it has, because the pancreas will get plugged up with all this mucus, and things like the chief pancreatic duct and other smaller ducts cannot deliver digestive juices, which makes it virtually impossible to digest food, because almost all of your enzymes get dumped into the small intestine from the pancreas. So, of course, the prognosis with cystic fibrosis is a lot longer now than it used to be, okay? But still, there is a lot of things that people have to battle, from respiratory illnesses to digestive issues and so forth. So it can. The problem is that a lot of this is dependent on the diffusion through that NKCC. And if there's no driving force, so you're going to increase the amount of chloride to a certain extent in those cells, and then the NKCC will stop because there's no driving force that's really allowing it anymore. So there can be, but the problem ends up mostly becoming this thick mucus that plugs things up. So there is no treatment. It is just taking care of the symptoms as they come about. So helping with respiratory issues. They do treatments in the sense of trying to break up that mucus, but really what you're doing is not fixing the problem. You're just trying to deal with some of the symptoms that are coming about. A lot of people are on digestive supplements to replace the enzymes that they can't secrete because the pancreas is so plugged up. Doesn't affect hormones, right, because those go into the blood, but it does affect all those enzymes. Good. So the cilia, as we know, they have to beat upward towards the pharynx, help to kind of move things up and out. That was our mucociliary escalator, where we either spit it out or swallow it. Again, whatever you do is entirely up to you. There's no judgment on my part, because I have to swallow it every time. Okay, respiratory zone. Like I said, I've tried spitting it out, and it's just abysmal. So respiratory zone, that's only going to be alveoli. Okay, the alveoli are designed to specifically be the best equipped for diffusion. And that's because of their very thin epithelial layers. Besides the alveoli, we do have what are called respiratory bronchioles, and that's just because they're pretty thin as well. And then there's alveolar ducts, which is kind of a stem that all the alveoli bud off of, okay? Those are really areas where gases can be exchanged, but 99% of it happens really just at those alveoli. If we take a look at what is called a lung lobule, you'll see here, so this up here is a bronchiole leading down to this respiratory bronchiole, the alveolar ducts, and then all of the alveoli that are kind of bulging off of those alveolar ducts. These thin, kind of pinkish little strands surrounding the alveoli are elastic fibers. The alveoli are very well coated with elastic fibers that give the lung a property known as elasticity. And we'll talk about what elasticity is and why it is so important in lung function. Besides that, the alveoli have a very, very significant amount of blood supply. So when you look at this little area right here, you'll see that the alveoli are covered by extensive capillary networks, and these capillaries provide a very large surface area for exchange of gas between the alveolar airspace and the plasma inside the capillary itself. The lungs experience a very high blood flow, but at the same time, a very low pressure. So the lungs are considered to be a high flow, low pressure system. Now, one thing that oftentimes just kind of blows people's mind is the fact that the lungs get the exact same cardiac output as the body does. So the body gets 5.25 liters of blood per minute, right? The lungs get the exact same. And so sometimes people are like, that's impossible. The lungs are so small. How could that be? Well, okay, think about it. What if they didn't? So what if the body needs 5 liters of blood per minute, but the lungs only get 1 liter per minute? What would happen? Deficit in oxygenation, right? Big time. Because you're only oxygenating 1 liter, but then you need to send out 5. So you have to match your cardiac outputs to the lung, to the body, right? That's a lot of cardiac output to the lung. But the pressure is extremely low. And there's 2 reasons why the pressure is very low. Right ventricle is nowhere near as thick as the left, so it doesn't produce as much force. And the blood vessels in the lungs diverge very quickly. So pressure falls very, very quickly by the time it makes it to the arterioles that are in the lung region. So pressure in the lungs is only about 25/8, roughly, as your diastolic, systolic pressures. And that's far, far lower than what you would find in systemic circulation. Okay? Good. I want to focus more on the alveoli and talk a little bit more about their structure. I hope that most of this is review, but the reason why I'm covering it is because it's important for us to continue talking about what's happening with respiratory function. So alveolar structure. The alveoli themselves are very thin because they're made up of only a single layer of epithelial cells. They are simple squamous, so they're very flat, okay? And you'll notice that each alveoli within the lung are connected to each other by these little pores. So they're all interconnected. Alveoli are not all the same size. You have some big ones, some small ones, and then kind of everything in between. The cells on here that are colored in purple, that make up the entire wall and border of the alveoli, are referred to as type 1 alveolar cells. They make up the largest distribution, the largest concentration, and they are simply your diffusion cells. So it's where gases diffuse across. Okay? So you'll see that wherever there are capillaries, that's where you're going to be seeing the diffusion taking place between those cell layer walls. The other ones, which are these yellow ones right here, are type 2 alveolar cells. And the type 2 alveolar cells are actually cuboidal, so they're a little bit bigger. They do not function for diffusion. Instead, the type 2 alveolar cells produce a liquid called surfactant. And this liquid is really important in lung function, and we will discuss how in a little bit here. The Alveoli have a very large capillary density, okay? And again, that should make sense to us because alveoli are where the blood will be able to pick up oxygen that has been brought in from the environment and then deposit CO2 that needs to be expelled back out into the environment. So there's a huge capillary density. There is interstitial fluid, but it is much smaller than what you might find in other places of the body. So there is a very, very, very thin layer of interstitial fluid. And again, the reason for this is diffusion distance. The more you can optimize gas diffusion, the best, right? So making this membrane as thin as possible is the best thing that you can do to make diffusion as optimum as possible. There's obviously only so much you can thin this out because there are cells of the capillary, cells of the alveoli, but if you can avoid having too much fluid between them, that again really optimizes diffusion. So surfactant is a liquid that type 2 alveolar cells make. And they don't start making this liquid until you are roughly about 26 weeks, roughly, gestation. So development still in the uterus. Prior to that, these type 2 alveolar cells really haven't made surfactant yet. And surfactant is an extremely important chemical found inside our alveoli, which reduces surface tension, okay? And we're going to talk a little bit about surface tension and bubbles here in a minute. But imagine that the alveoli are bubbles. And inside of the alveoli, there is a little bit of water that creates a surface tension. Surface tension has relatively powerful forces and can cause things to collapse, particularly things like bubbles. Surfactant breaks that surface tension apart so that these alveoli retain a somewhat partially filled nature to them. So when you look at the alveoli here, you'll notice that they are filled and round, whereas if you look at these here, they have become flattened, somewhat collapsed, right? These alveoli here have a sufficient amount of surfactant, while these over here do not. This loss or no surfactant is more so common in babies that are born premature. And they are premature enough to where their bodies haven't started synthesizing surfactant yet. That causes something called infant respiratory distress syndrome. And really what it does is cause a lot of work to try to breathe. It's very hard to breathe because now, as an organism, you have to use your muscular power to overcome this high surface tension. And it's not easy to do, especially for an infant that has underdeveloped muscle. So it's very, very distressful to try to breathe that way, right? So what do they do? What can they do? Well, certainly respirators help. Being put on ventilators will force air into the lungs. But there are medicines, actually, that can be administered to the baby, but also to the mom if they are afraid of an early birth. Because sometimes that's why you go all the time to the doctor to check prenatal care, that kind of stuff. If there is fear that that might happen, they can give medicines that will induce surfactant production and kind of start to get surfactant to somewhat build up. But more often than not, it has to be a ventilator until the surfactant starts getting made naturally to where it no longer creates that kind of collapsing pressure on the inside of the alveoli. So kind of where does this concept come from? It's again a little bit of physics, but it's nothing major. So the law of Laplace, okay? The law of Laplace takes into account bubbles. So we're looking at two different bubbles here. And these black arrows represent pressure. The way you want to think of pressure in terms of this relationship is kind of a collapsing pressure, an inward pressure, okay? And that inward pressure is dependent on two different factors. One of them is surface tension, and the other one is size of the bubble. So if you look at this, you have a really big bubble here, okay, and then a smaller one. Both of them have equal surface tensions. So surface tension is depicted by the capital T here. And you'll notice that the larger one has a pressure of 3, while the smaller one has a pressure of 6. What does that tell you in terms of pressure? So in other words, which one is more likely or has the greater force of tendency to collapse inward? The smaller one, because it has a higher pressure, right? This concept can be translated to alveoli, okay? And if we were to translate that to alveoli, I want you guys to think, what conclusions could you make given that law of Laplace? Couple more seconds. Okay. Somebody please tell me what you picked and why. What do you think? If we were to translate this information to alveoli, what do you think would be true? Yes.
Since it has a high pressure, it would collapse, it would be harder to get
Okay, so because that makes perfect sense. So because it has higher pressure, smaller ones, right, have higher pressure, and because they have higher collapsing pressure, then it's going to take more work to push that open, to get it to expand, in comparison to one that has a smaller collapsing pressure. Okay, good. So B is definitely true. Given what we just talked about, what do we know about the surface tensions? They're the same. So there's not a difference in surface tension. And the same would be true in the lungs. There is more or less an equal distribution of, let's say, water that creates the surface tension. So what this means then is that given that law, it is harder to fill smaller alveoli than larger ones. From the standpoint of practicality, physiology, and so forth, do you think that's actually true? Do you really think that it's harder for your lungs to fill smaller alveoli than bigger ones? Or is it the same all throughout?
Depending on where the alveoli are, I would think that it might be easier or harder depending on if they're being pushed up against.
Just think size. If we're just thinking size of the alveoli and where we've made it as an organism so far, do you really think that we'd have a lung where some alveoli are easy to fill and some are really hard to fill? No, right? That doesn't make practical sense. So we have devised a mechanism that makes it equally the same amount of work to fill all alveoli, okay? So how is that happening? if you now look at, let's say these are alveoli, okay, and you see they have different sizes, but one of these has a much higher concentration of surfactant than the other one. And that surfactant, again, helps to break apart surface tension. So if you look at tension here, it's higher in this, let's say, bigger bubble, but then the radius is larger, so the pressure comes out to 2. And if you look at the smaller bubble, while the radius is smaller, there's way more surfactant in there, which really drops down that surface tension, and it makes the pressure the same. So that's essentially what we have in the lungs to equalizes pressure throughout all aspects of that respiratory tract, particularly at the alveoli. It takes the same amount of work to fill big alveoli, small alveoli, and everything in between because we have this equalized pressure through surfactant. The other thing is that there are pores that connect the alveoli, so air pressure can equalize itself as well as it moves through the entire system. Okay, good. I'm gonna let you guys go. You can have 15-minute early break. Enjoy it. I'll see you guys on Tuesday.